When you need to build up your team to handle the growing chaos at work, use Indeed Sponsored Jobs. It gives your job post the boost it needs to be seen and helps reach people with the right skills, certifications, and more. Spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. That's Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need a hiring hero? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs.
This episode is brought to you by Accenture. When your advertising operations fall out of sync, everything else follows. Spotify and Accenture are working together to reinvent the rhythm of ad sales, using automation, analytics, and smarter workflows to simplify campaign delivery and access better data across the business. The result? Less time spent on operations, more time connecting brands with the moments and fandoms that matter most. Learn more at accenture.com/Spotify.
Hello and welcome to The Shift, the podcast that aims to tell the no-holds-barred truth about being a woman post-40. Created and hosted by me, writer and broadcaster, Sam Baker. Where do you turn when the identity you've clung to for decades slips away? That's the position today's guest, Jane Green, found herself in at 55. Her solution? She packed a case and ran away. Anyone who is a fan of women's commercial fiction, aka chick lit, in the 90s and noughties will know Jane's name. Along with Marion Keyes and Helen Fielding, she wrote 21 novels, the first of which, Jemima J, was right up there with Bridget Jones in the States. And for a while, her books were piled high in bookshops all over the world, until they weren't. But now her subject is herself. And I guarantee her story will make you want to chuck it all in and move to Morocco. Rewilding is her first memoir and recounts the breakup of her 24-year marriage and what came next. At 55, realising she had vanished inside the trappings of her Instagram-worthy life, she left the marital home on the east coast of America with only a suitcase and went to Marrakesh. Once she got over the shock and terror of being alone after bringing up 4 children, she set about the job of rewilding herself, dropping the armour that had seen her through her adult life and stripping herself back to the original Jane. Several years on, Jane is living proof that she wasn't escaping her life, but reclaiming it.
I remember waking up on the morning of my 50th birthday. I was having this big party in the garden, and I walked into the bathroom and I looked at myself in the mirror and I just thought, I've got no idea who I am.
Jane joined me to talk about the long process of returning to herself from a life she no longer recognised. We also discussed the gift of menopause, the curse of perfection, why no one should ever give up financial independence, being a walkaway wife, learning to recognise red flags, facing the fear, and how to answer the question, how did I get stuck in a life I don't even recognise? Now, just a couple more things before we get going. Firstly, apologies if the sound is iffy in places. I say if, it is iffy in places. Jane was sitting outside because of the heat, so we're dealing with some external noises. Secondly, and if by the end of this your heart is beating faster, Jane is hosting a 5-day rewilding retreat in Marrakesh in October. You can find out more at www.kitaba, that's Kitaba, Marrakesh.com. Can I just say, I absolutely love you for smoking. I really want to start.
I know. And not only that, these are really cheap here, these little Vogues. They're these little skinny cigarettes.
Oh, I know the ones, yeah.
I gave up for 25 years, but everybody smokes in Morocco and fuck it. I'm really enjoying it. I know it's terrible for me and at some point I'm going to have to give up, but I'm really enjoying it.
You look like you are, to be honest. It's so interesting because the last 3 or 4 years, I've really, really wanted to start. I've got such a hankering to smoke. Anyway, I don't want to waste all our time talking about the fact that I want to start smoking. But are you in your lovely courtyard in your?
And for the same price, I could have a 2-bedroom flat in maybe Kensal Rise.
Yeah, no one can afford to live in London anymore. But first of all, I just want to say to anybody listening that Jane is sitting in her riad in the middle of the Moroccan countryside. And if you weren't, if you are, you're going to be so jealous by the end of this conversation anyway. But Jane, can you just give me a little twirl again? Because I know you've shown me already, but show me another one. And for anybody listening, I'm going to put it. Oh my God. I'm going to put this in the little video in the Substack so that you can all be really, really, really jealous. Oh my God. Jane, how can we all rewild?
Oh,
I should be more polite. Thank you for coming on the shift. And oh my God, your book, so great.
Oh, Sam.
Really, I loved it. I mean, I didn't love it for you, the pain that you went through to get to this point, of course. But no, absolutely. I was like inhaling it. Before we get going, let's tell us the kind of definition of rewilding and why you chose rewilding as a phrase rather than any of the millions of other ways you could have put it.
Actually, I have to credit our mutual friend Salima Saxton with this because she really came up with it. And I thought it was brilliant. And we were talking about gardening and how rewilding is this concept in gardening. And in order for a garden to thrive, rewilding is now very much in vogue, which is taking a garden back to its natural state, planting it with indigenous plants, native plants. And that allows it to thrive. And Salima started applying it to sort of womanhood. And as we talked, I realized that for me, what it meant was I started to think what happens to so many women is we are these brave, fearless, strong little girls. And then often at puberty, we start to change. And for many of us, it changes beforehand because, those of us who grew up in difficult families often learnt to people please and tiptoe and walk on eggshells very early. But it goes into overdrive at puberty when we suddenly discover boys and we suddenly want to be liked and we start to change ourselves in order to make ourselves more palatable. And on it goes throughout our lives. And we do it to ourselves. We create all of these constructs and personas and we step into these roles of who we want to be seen as in the world and how to be acceptable by friends, by colleagues, by partners, by other mothers. And what I have observed happening to so many women in their 50s, it tends to happen in their sort of late 40s, 50s. There's a confluence of things that happen. Children leave home, menopause hits, and suddenly so many of us realize that we have no idea who we are anymore. And what rewilding is how do you tap back into the essence of who you were, the purest essence of you before you started building these constructs and stepping into these roles.
Oh, you've literally just distilled every single conversation that I've ever had, I think, with women in their probably not early 40s. It probably is a very late 40s, 50s thing, because in the 40s, still often, given how late many women are having children, they're still in the parental thing in their 50s, but certainly your 40s, you're still like in the weeds of all of that stuff. And then, suddenly, and I don't know, I'd love to know why you think this is, all of those decisions that you made for whatever reason, but let's say in good faith, in your 20s and 30s particularly, and that really served you, they just suddenly don't work anymore. And whether it might be family, it might be relationships, very often work, everything changes. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think menopause has a huge amount to do with it. And I think that we think we're prepared for menopause. We know about things like hot flushes and night sweats and irritability. But what we're not prepared for, what nobody warns us about, is the seismic change in our neurological rewiring. And I think we spend our lives suppressing our own needs and wants and learning to say yes instead of no, to keep partners happy, to make for a peaceful household, in order to do all the things that we have to do as adult women in the world. And menopause it is an earthquake. It is a seismic shift in our wiring. And actually what it does and what nobody warns us about is it cracks open all of those constructs and those roles. And so suddenly we're no longer willing to suppress our needs. We're no longer willing to say yes when we mean no. And often, many of us, that's the only way we've known how to function throughout our lives. And we've done it. And sometimes we've done it very successfully to the outside world. But when menopause comes along, all those roles start to shatter and we're left feeling completely untethered and lost. What we don't realize is that it's actually the most joyous gift if you choose to awaken and to really deal, because it's all old stuff. We all carry all of our wounds and our childhood and the indignities and the diminishment. We carry all of that and we somehow swallow it in order to function in the world. And menopause stops allowing us to swallow it. And that's the time when actually we have to deal with it in order to have a life filled with joy, which is not just possible, but I mean, joy that comes from healing all that stuff. But really, all of those lifelong wounds just come roaring back with menopause. And I think that's what causes this enormous shift. And we're not prepared. Nobody talks about this. Nobody tells us of the emotional and mental and the neurological toll that menopause has on us.
I mean, I want to kind of obviously get into the nitty gritty of your personal experience in a minute, because I'm nothing if not deeply nosy. But do you think there is an element of a social element going on that we're seeing so much of it now? I mean, I'm not saying that we're the first generation who ever did this, of course not. But I do wonder whether we have different expectations. You know, we kind of, the point at which someone suddenly says, okay, we shuffle off now. We weren't kind of brought up like that to believe that we had that purpose. And so just do what you're told. Do you know what I mean? I mean, I know we all discovered pretty quickly that having it all meant doing it all. But I do wonder. And also there's obviously the wherewithal, because there's the seismic shift, and there's also the capacity, whether that be financial, social, support network, whatever, to do something about it. And not everybody has that.
No, but everybody can have that. I mean, whenever I speak to young women, I always say to them, please don't stop working when you have children, because it gives you choices and you never know what's going to happen in life. And having your own money, it doesn't have to be huge, but having your own independence and being defined by something other than someone's wife or someone's mother, it just gives you far more choices than you would ever have. But I think ultimately we are the generation that were told we could have it all. I love what you said about I do it all. But it also has given us much more agency. So even, I've seen women, I did not just work throughout my whole career and motherhood. I was the sole provider and the sole breadwinner. So it was an enormous pressure. But yes, I had a career that felt like it was gone. I mean, I felt very much like I had a failing career by the time I left my marriage. But I also know that I'm a worker and I'm a grafter and I'm always going to figure it out. And I had to trust that I was going to be fine. And I do see more and more women who haven't worked in their marriages have come undone and they have started working again. It's not the kind of work that they would do in their 20s. It's not going into a 9-to-5 office job necessarily, but they're starting companies, they're joining with friends, they're doing things, they're figuring out how to support themselves. And I think what the Have It All movement gave us was agency. And so I do think that's why we're seeing so many women leave now when they go through this seismic shift. They're even calling it, there's a term for it now, the walkaway wife. And I think more and more women are realizing that they don't have to be dependent on the man in their life.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's one of the I think it's the second most popular piece on The Shift that I ever wrote was about all of my friends getting divorced, basically. And it's had hundreds of thousands of views. And it just really struck a chord. It was about 2.5 years ago now.
And I hear from women on a weekly basis. I get women coming up to me in the street who are not my readers. They've never read any of my novels, but they followed this journey. They've started following me through this. And the last time I was in America, these, women kept coming up to me, sidling up to me in shops and saying, I'm so sorry to bother you, but I just want to say that you're so brave and I wish that I could do what you have done. I'm cheering you on.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because that is a bit of a shift from the experience you had, but also other people that I've spoken to, of a lot of people, women and men, who can't quite believe that you would do it, who kind of think, well, if you've done it, you must be leaving. The idea that you'll be leaving, not for someone else, but for yourself. You know, I would say that 4 or 5 years ago, I mean, I've got a friend who split up with her husband during lockdown, but lockdown was a coincidence rather than the factor. And she had a good couple of years after that of people just assuming that she had someone else tucked away, that she wouldn't have left it. And it does feel like people are getting better at understanding that you might just reach a point where you go, do you know what? Enough.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, one of the other thing, of course, is that nobody knows the true story of a marriage. Nobody knows what goes on behind closed doors. And we all present these perfect looking lives on Instagram. Certainly my former husband and I looked as if we had a perfect life and a perfect marriage. When I left him, one of our really dear friends sent me a message one day. And she said, I'm so sorry that you blew up your marriage for a midlife crisis. And I was furious. And I wrote back and I actually said, how dare you? You have no idea what goes on in a marriage. You have no idea what my marriage was like. And she doubled down, or doubled down rather. And I could see, but that's a really common thing. I think that my former husband probably thinks that still. I think he doesn't really understand why I left. And of course, the truth is that any marriage, any relationship is a dance that two people do. You're bringing all of your stuff and all of those wounds and anything unprocessed into that relationship. And you always have a part in that relationship. It is a dance that two people do together. And actually, one of the things that I was really clear on when I realized I needed to turn this into a memoir, which was completely terrifying. But I thought, I don't want this to be a memoir of blame. I'm not a victim here. And I understand that whatever it was that happened in my marriage that caused me to leave, I have an equal part in this. You know, we always attract what we think we deserve. And I had so little self-worth and value that of course I was going to end up in relationships where I didn't feel valued or seen, and I didn't ultimately feel loved. And when I left, I also understood that unless I did the work and looked at my part, I was going to have the same relationship again.
Tell us just, whistle stop about your life before you left. Where were you at? What would somebody looking from outside have seen? Because you had previously been phenomenally best-selling author, hadn't you? The kind of one of the founders of the chick lit movement, which I can't believe those words came out of my mouth. Disgusting. But one of the most successful commercial women's fiction writers, living it up in the Hamptons, Connecticut, sweetie, being kind of glamorous, and you look very glamorous and groomed now, but different. So tell us about that life and what was happening.
I started my career in England, and I'm a Londoner. I was born and raised in London, and I've been married twice. My first husband was an American. He was very happy living in London, but the second novel I wrote was a book called Jemima J. And Jemima J was published in the States and became this enormous bestseller and sold millions. And I just remember thinking the opportunity there was so huge. And I'd always loved America. I'd always been fascinated by America. I was married to an American. So we went off to live in the States. And I had an extraordinary life for many years. I did leave that husband, and then I moved into this little beach cottage and fell in love with my landlord, who became my second husband. And I continued writing these books, and I had a string of bestsellers, and we looked like we had this very glamorous, wonderful life. It started really to come undone during COVID. But I will also say that I never really fitted in there. And I'm not sure, I'm not a good group person. I don't really fit in anywhere. I'm a little bit quirky, but I'm the consummate chameleon. I can turn myself into whoever I need to be in order to fit in. And I did that for 24 years in the States. And I never really did fit in, but I wore all the right clothes. I lived in the right houses, I threw the right parties. But inside, I never quite felt I fitted in. And then, of course, I had the children moving out. I had menopause. And then there was COVID. And also, my husband hadn't worked meaningfully since 2011 when he was made redundant. And it was, at the time, it was fine because I was really focused on my career and he was amazing with children and was really seminal in raising my 4 kids, his stepchildren. But of course, the kids were now leaving home and my career had changed. I'd made some terrible career choices. I changed agents and really made the wrong decision. I stopped being published in the UK. I'd sold a book in the UK and they never brought it out. And my career, it just felt like my career was dying. And I wasn't earning anything like I had been earning. And I'd been supporting my 4 children, plus his 2 children who lived with us and us by myself in what was for many years a very big life. And I couldn't do it anymore. I felt like I was drowning. And I was begging him to contribute. And he just wasn't, I think mostly he wasn't able to hear me. I don't think he ever understood the sort of crisis that was, and there were other things that were deeply problematic for me that I haven't written about because it's not my story to tell. But there were other things, and certainly if you'd looked at my social media, you would have thought that everything was, even though I couldn't afford to keep the big house that we lived in. We had a beautiful old rambly farmhouse, but it was crumbling and I couldn't afford all the work that it needed. I started to look at all these other gorgeous little farmhouses in cheaper towns in the country, and I love the country. I'd always wanted to live in the country anyway. And my husband refused to leave that town, which is a town in which he'd been raised. And I had bought this tiny little, quite dark beach cottage when we first met, which was my nest egg. It was my sort of investment. And he insisted that we move into the beach cottage. And, I had 4 kids who were at university who needed a place to stay. There was no room for them. There was barely room for us. I couldn't host, and there's nothing I love more than gathering the people I love in my home and feeding them. And I couldn't do it anymore because we couldn't fish anyone. And I just slowly started to feel like I was dying. I felt like I was underwater. I was in the most terrible depression. I was making very little money. And I think I'd always equated success with money. And actually, my husband was really good about that. He would really try and buoy me up and say, Jane, you've had 18 New York Times bestsellers and you've sold over 10 million books. By any metric, you're successful. And just because you're not earning the big bucks anymore, it doesn't mean you're not successful. But I felt like a failure. And I also felt very alone. I felt like I was the only one who could save the sinking ship, and I couldn't save the sinking ship. And every morning I'd walk down this little narrow staircase and I'd stop and I'd look at this tiny little living room that I tried to make very beautiful, but it never felt like mine. And I'd look at it and think, how did I get stuck in a life I don't recognize? And actually the thing that ended it was the same argument that we'd been having for 18 years. And all the times we'd have that argument, usually he'd sort of blow up in anger and leave the house and go off driving to cool off. And then he'd come back and apologize and it would be fine until the next time. And I'd said to him a couple of times, listen, I love you. And I really, really did love him. I love you, but I'm really scared that if X, Y, and Z doesn't change, I know me, I'm going to wake up one morning and the switch will be flipped. And once it's flipped, there is no way back for me. And I'm scared because I'm not near that, but I'm getting there. And I think, like so many husbands, and I've heard men say this as well, when their wives try and express themselves honestly from a very emotionally stable place, they can't hear it. They just think it's the same old argument that you've always had. They just need to calm you down, reassure you, and then you'll carry on. What they don't understand is those changes need to be made. This is like when we are scared enough, vulnerable enough, brave enough to actually speak the truth about what we need, and we're still not heard, that's when women leave.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, it struck me, and I think I recognized it because of spending so many years presenting a persona myself and knowing that feeling of when the friction, if you like, of who I was and the persona that I presented got too much. And it's so when reading Rewilding, I was watching the kind of the pillars of Jane Green's identity folding in on themselves. You know, Jane Green, best-selling novelist with this amazing American life, you know, mother of loads and a big entertainer, a big hostess, and that, you know, so then that losing the house might like feel like a material thing, but it was almost like a final pillar of this identity. So can you remember when the persona that you had worked pretty hard to develop and keep going, when you started to feel the friction?
I would say the kernel of this whole huge change in my life started on the morning of my 50th birthday. And 50 just felt very big. You know, I felt like, well, it's not really, I mean, maybe it's the halfway point, but it was really beyond the halfway point. But I remember waking up on the morning of my 50th birthday. I was having this big party in the garden, and I walked into the bathroom and I looked at myself in the mirror, and I just thought, I've got no idea who I am. I'd spent so many years trying to fit in and wearing the right clothes and always, I think, carrying, as so many women do, this secret shame that I wasn't enough. And so all of the glamour and the persona was about making sure that nobody looked at me and saw through that to what I secretly knew to be true about myself, which is that I wasn't enough. And I looked at myself in the mirror on the morning of my 50th birthday and I thought, I've got no idea who I am. It sounds very woo-woo, but it literally was I heard a little voice in my head that said, who would you be if you stopped caring what anyone else thought? And that was really the beginning. And I didn't understand it then, but that was the beginning. And as time progressed, you know, I went through a period of a huge depression and enormous pain, and I withdrew. I became very, very isolated. But I think sometimes you have to go through that great pain in order to rebuild in a completely new way. And I also understood that I was fed up with colluding with the lies. We weren't wealthy. In fact, we were completely struggling. I was the one paying for everything, and I couldn't do it anymore. And I wasn't willing to keep pretending. And very much the town in which I lived and the people that we were surrounded by, you sort of had to present the front. Otherwise, you were terrified that you'd be ostracized. And I just thought, I don't care anymore. I actually don't care. What I need to start being honest about everything. Yeah. So it started, I think, as my marriage was coming to an end, even though I wasn't conscious of that. I never wanted to look at my marriage. I never looked at my marriage as being the fundamental issue. And perhaps it wasn't. I mean, perhaps my husband was sort of collateral damage, because really it was about me being fueled by shame, not feeling good enough, and stepping in and having spent most of my adult life stepping into this persona. And the persona was great. The persona was successful. She was a best-selling author. She could do anything. She could walk into a room full of thousands and talk to them very comfortably. But suddenly my career was failing. I wasn't earning anything. And so the persona crumbled. And then who was I left with? I had no idea. I was left with a broken little girl who felt inadequate in every way.
So can you tell us a little bit about that little girl? Because while you've been talking, I've been thinking, where does the not enoughness come from?
can't say too much because, memoir is so hard because, of course, there are people around who you care about, who you love, and you have to sort of make your choice about what to put on the page. But I will say that my childhood was not easy, but again, from the outside, it looked wonderful, very much like my marriage. But yeah, and that's the thing, it was all about appearances, but actually I was a child who very much felt diminished and unseen and unheard. And I learned very young how to walk on eggshells, how to accept being criticized, how to accept being, that feeling of not being enough. That is a very old, familiar feeling for me. So of course I recreated that in my marriages. That was home.
So you didn't run away to the next town. You ran away to Marrakesh, as you do. Why? Why run? And why run to Marrakesh?
So I had written a novel during COVID called Sister Stardust, which is the only time I've ever written historical fiction. And it was set in 1960s Marrakesh. And I hadn't been to Marrakesh until just before COVID, but I'd always had a lifelong fascination with it. And as soon as the plane touched down and I stepped out into that sort of blazing dry heat, and I just felt, I felt completely at home, but I also felt completely alive. And when we were living in that tiny little dark cottage, the only time I felt able to breathe and the only time I felt myself come back to life was when I was in Marrakesh. So I kept sort of bouncing back and forth during the last year of my marriage. And in the end, I said to my husband, look, I can't do another winter in Connecticut. I can write really well in Marrakesh. I need to keep writing. Why don't we rent a little riad that I can use as a sort of winter writing retreat? So he had agreed. So I'd already lined up this house in Marrakesh. But I remember I'd overhear friends saying to him, so, when's Jane coming back? And he'd go, oh, she'll be back in February. And I think, no, I bloody won't. I'm not coming back before May or June. But I already had the house. And I felt a real calling. Marrakesh feels like a deeply spiritual place to me. And Moroccans are the most open-hearted people I have ever met. And I just somehow felt that this was where I had to be in order to come back to life and in order to heal.
In the book, you use the word exhale a lot. Why is that the defining feeling?
I think it's about looseness and freedom. And there's a phrase that I also use in the book where I say, I've been learning to wear life like a loose garment. And there was something about, I felt very trapped in a life in which I didn't belong. And I felt that for years, even during the good years. I mean, I understand now it was always a role and a persona. And there's something about letting it out, wearing the loose garment, the art of surrender, accepting life on life's terms, rather than this very tightly controlled, oh my God, what if this next book doesn't work? How am I going to have another bestseller? How am I going to get my career back? That all feels very tight and constricting, and I never felt able to breathe. And exhaling is being able to breathe and being able to move through life in a much freer, looser way, kind of understanding that we have to accept life on life's terms. We can't control it. The more you try and bend it to your will, the harder it's going to be. And once you actually relax into it and accept things as they come, the easier it is, the more peaceful everything in your life becomes.
So what was that like? I mean, you said you got off the plane and you instantly felt at home, but you were walking away from a long marriage. So when you put the key in the door, and you talk in the book about being alone almost for the first time, really, how did that feel when you shut the door behind you, put down your case?
It felt very contradictory. I'm somebody who's never been frightened of being alone. I love my own company. I'm very comfortable. I've always required a lot of time on my own, but I'd been a wife for 25 years. It felt utterly surreal. It felt like this wasn't my life, like I was sort of on a cloud, not necessarily in a good way. It felt like I couldn't quite, my feet weren't quite touching the ground. Nothing felt quite real. And it was simultaneously exciting, exhilarating, particularly having come from this cottage that felt, the cottage sort of encapsulated everything that was, it embodied everything that was wrong in my life. It was dark, it was oppressive. I felt like the ceilings were pushing down on me. And I stepped into this riad that was not a big riad, but it was filled with light. And the courtyard just reached up to the sky. And I felt that I could breathe. And I also felt terrified and utterly overwhelmed. I mean, I had no idea what I was doing. And I knew that I had to try and stay as present as I possibly could, because if I dwelt on what I'd just done and the past, I would be overwhelmed with grief. And if I worried about the future, I would be overwhelmed with fear. And actually, I spent the first few months in numbing myself. I refused to look at any of it. And I did a huge amount of partying. I accepted invitations from anybody who asked me. I had far too much to drink almost nightly. I spent the first 9 months dancing on rooftops and just numbing myself to the grief and the loss and the fear. And it was that was in January, and it was probably October of that year, I think September, when I realized that I couldn't run from this anymore, that I had to quiet down and I had to actually face those really uncomfortable, difficult feelings. And I had to face the grief and the fear and the loss, and leaving 3 of my 4 children in America. 1 of them's in the UK, but 3 of the 4 are in the States. And I had to actually feel all of it. And I'm somebody who's kind of spent a lifetime running from difficult feelings. I'll use anything to numb it, anything at all. And I'd been doing that in Marrakesh, and I just understood the only way I'm going to get through this is to feel all of it. And I actually got myself into intensive somatic therapy, somatic therapy is really based on there's a very famous book by Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score. The idea being that every trauma and emotional wound we've ever experienced is stored somewhere in our body. And I felt like I'd been in and out of therapy for years, and it was just talking, and it didn't give me any tools to change. I had a really clear intellectual understanding of exactly why I was the way I was, but I had no roadmap to change it. And somatic therapy taught me to actually sink from my overthinking brain into my body and locate all of that grief and all of that pain and those old wounds and feel them and embrace them, knowing that they weren't going to kill me. And it was through kind of that therapy that I did come out the other side as a very, very different person.
Tomorrow morning is knocking. Stock your fridge now. How about a creamy mocha frappuccino drink? Or a sweet vanilla? Smooth caramel maybe? Or a white chocolate mocha? Whichever you choose, delicious coffee awaits. Find Starbucks Frappuccino drinks wherever you buy your groceries.
How did your children respond when you said, I'm off? By the way, I'm in Marrakesh now.
Well, the first thing was telling them that we had broke up, that I had left. And I thought they would be devastated. And he remains a wonderful stepfather, and they love him deeply. I thought they would all be devastated. And every one of my children said, Mum, we love him and we couldn't stand the way he treated you. And I was so staggered because I hadn't even seen it. I'd had no idea. It had become so normal to me that I wasn't even aware of any of it. And they were really supportive. They understood that Marrakesh spoke to me. But, and I live with this guilt today, I couldn't afford to keep a base in the States for my children to come home to. And 2 of them were launched and out in the world working, and 2 of them were still at university. And I removed their ability to come home and to have a safe place to come home to during the holidays. And that remains a huge sorrow for me.
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? Yeah.
I mean, that said, I was never a helicopter parent. You know, my children are very self-sufficient. They're very independent. And actually, I'm probably much closer to them now. They call me far more than they ever did when I lived in the States. And they've also become much closer to each other, which has been an absolute joy to see. They have all really bonded. So that has been a lovely unintended consequence.
Well, I guess, and I don't know because I'm not a mother, but I guess that to a certain extent, their primary relationship with each other was through you, and that kind of had to change as your relationships then changed a bit while you were rebuilding yourself.
But, you know, I write about this in the book. I went back there last November for Thanksgiving, and actually it was brutal. I find any holidays, Christmas, Thanksgiving, absolutely brutal. Either I'm not with my children, or Thanksgiving I flew back to be with my children, but I'm used to being the mistress of my kitchen. I'm mum with my apron on in the kitchen, cooking up a feast, surrounded by my babies and all their friends. And suddenly I was a guest in my son's apartment. I was a guest at my son's table, and they did a beautiful job. The kids did all the cooking. They did all the cleaning up. They were amazing. But I felt utterly discombobulated because I was not mum in the kitchen gathering my chicks in the nest. I was a guest at their table.
So how does that fit with who you are now? We were talking earlier about pillars of Jane, you know, the mother, the hostess, the best-selling author. Without those pillars are still gone, aren't they? What are the pillars of Jane now, if you like?
Well, they're gone, but they're back in a different way. Like, one of the pillars of my life has always been friendship, and female friendships have brought me the most amount of joy and the most amount of pain in my life. It definitely has been the central theme of my life. And I've had to build friendships here. I'm also on the same time zone as England again. So all of my oldest friends, I now FaceTime with every morning. I mean, every morning starts with 3 or 4 FaceTimes with my oldest, closest friends. And I've built friends here. I was in the Medina for the first 2 years, and now I'm in a little villa in the countryside. And I shipped a container over from the States containing everything that I've ever collected or bought for the last 40 years. So I'm surrounded by my things again. And I do cook again. So I have friends. I garden again. I've created a gorgeous little garden here. I'm growing my own vegetables again. I have a very peaceful life again that feels like a life I recognize. It just happens to be in Morocco. I have guitars everywhere because all my kids play music, and they do come. I'm still waiting for the eldest though, but the others have all been, and that's my favorite thing of all. But I do have a life that I recognize. My pillars are still friendship, still a home. I am a consummate nester, and I'm back to having a very peaceful, quiet, more reclusive life. And I've become very, very discerning, because part of rewilding is about learning to say no, to stop people pleasing, learning to be honest, learning to set boundaries, choosing very intentionally who you're going to spend time with, what you say yes to, what you do with your life. And it's really hard for many of us because we've never done that in our lives. And learning to do that is really, really difficult. Learning to say no is terrifying. But of course, it's habitual. And the more you do it, the easier it becomes. And I would say that I'm absolutely adoring my life right now. And I also know that this isn't my real life. First of all, I'm in a rented villa. I don't have a home yet. And London seems to be calling me back, or maybe not London, maybe the UK, not full time, but I definitely feel pulled back to my family and my friends and England in a way that I never thought I would be. And I have this sense that this is still life in the liminal. I'm in the in-between stage. This is a chapter, but it's not the final chapter. And I don't know what the next chapter will look like. And the old me would have been deeply uncomfortable with that because I wanted everything to be forever. This would be my forever house. This would be my forever friend. This would be, and I've learned to become comfortable in the discomfort of not knowing what's next. And again, trying to stay present, loving my life as is today, whilst recognizing that it's not going to look like this forever. And I have no idea what's next.
Do you put all of that learning down to the somatic therapy, or are there other things that have contributed to you getting to this healthy place?
Well, I think I am an overthinker. I'm fascinated by people, by the human experience, by why we do the things we do. I spent years in 12-step programs. As I said earlier, I will numb myself with just about anything. So I spent years in 12-step programs, which I still believe is the greatest toolkit that anyone can carry. And I've studied the human experience. I mean, I've written 22 novels about the human experience and what it is to be a woman in the world today. So I will acquire wisdom wherever I can find it.
I don't know. It's so, when I was reading Rewilding, there's so many things that leapt out at me about gratitude and judgment, and how we learn judgment at such a young age, and resentment. And we could go off on any of those tangents, but we won't. But one thing I did want to ask you before we get to the questions at the end is about red flags, because it seemed to me that you and so many of us teach ourselves to ignore them. So how, when you got back out there, and not just actually in dating and romantic and sexual relationships, but in friendships too, how did you teach yourself to see them and act on them?
Actually, I think the somatic therapy really was the changing point for me, because it taught me not to trust my mind. My mind will always trick me into thinking, into overriding my intuition and my body. Because if I want something, even if my body's saying this doesn't feel good, if I want it, I will override that feeling. And I have learned to listen to my body, not my mind. And I've definitely had a couple of sort of situationships and friendships where I've seen red flags, but I've wanted this and I've ignored it. And I think it's one of the great gifts of being female. I think we have extraordinary intuition. We all have it. The trick is learning to trust it, because it will never see you wrong. And we've all had experiences when we've fallen out with a friend, or a relationship has broken up, and we've always looked back and said, we knew then, but we didn't listen. And it's learning to trust our bodies, not our brains. And whenever we're activated, our central nervous system is activated, especially in dating, when we become obsessed and we're suddenly attached to glued to our phone, waiting for the next steps. That's, your needs are not being met, and it's activating your nervous system, and that is not a healthy foundation for a relationship. That's when you have to walk away.
You wrote something that I made a note of and now, of course, can't find. Oh, yeah. You said that I was a woman who was desperate to be chosen.
As so many of us are, when we don't feel good enough, all of those constructs and roles and personas are about being chosen by the right people, or the right man, or the right friends, or whatever it is. And actually, when you let all of those roles and constructs crumble and you become authentically yourself, you realize that you don't need to be chosen anymore. And that's where discernment comes in. You get to do the choosing. You get to listen to your intuition. You get to trust it. And you get to decide who you want to spend time with, and whether they are somebody who's worthy of you, whether they deserve you, rather than let me be good enough for them to choose me, which is how I spent decades.
Oh, I think so many of us have spent decades like that. And also the assumption, which is a mixture of growing up in a blame culture, but also kind of weirdly arrogant, that everything that happens is your fault.
Yeah, it is. It's very solipsistic, right? It all revolves around you. We haven't touched upon that, but that is also something. My ego, which was both, I had no self-esteem, but I covered that up with too much this false self-esteem, and it was all ego-driven and part of the sort of the death of the career and feeling like a failure and the marriage. And it also was letting go of the ego and letting go of needing it to always be about me.
Yeah, it's like learning to live without all those crutches, isn't it? And I don't mean really alcohol or drugs or whatever, although, you're back on the cigarettes and I'm jealous. But I mean the other crutches, the scaffolding of our personalities, if you like.
And that's the hidden gift of rewilding is that stripping away the scaffolding is absolutely terrifying. But then you've got something solid to build with. Then nothing's fake. There's no more scaffolding. It is just the original building standing there kind of strong and beautiful just because it's there.
Could you imagine? I really do need to ask you the questions that I always ask because that links so beautifully into the first one. But I just do have to ask you, can you imagine describing yourself or your situation or however you want to put it as strong and beautiful even 5 years ago?
Well, no, I think I wouldn't have said, and I don't mean beautiful in a physical sense. I mean truly just as a human being in the world. I mean, we're all exceptional. And I would have said I was strong, but it wasn't a true strength. I think I felt so very vulnerable that I projected an image of strong. So I would have said I was strong because that's what I wanted you to believe, but it wasn't actually coming from a foundation of strength. And now that I've moved halfway across the world by myself, knowing no one, and architected this whole new life that is completely authentic, I would say that's true today, and that would not have been true back then.
I mean, literally every part of the book. We could do a whole series because we could do an hour on how to make friends in a foreign country when you don't know anybody. We could do, being back out there. We could do that. We could be here all day. But anyway, questions I always ask at the end. And this one always feels pertinent, and I'm always fascinated by the answer, but it feels like it was written for you. Like, what is your emotional age?
I think it might be about 427, because I think that I think perhaps back in the day it might have been 7, but I think that I have had such an emotional shift, and I have such perspective on things that I didn't have before. And sometimes I feel very, very old in all of the right ways.
Brilliant. Give us a book recommendation. So it can be something recent or it can be a forever book. It can be anything you like.
Oh, I'm going to throw at you my all-time favorite book ever, which is Brother of the More Famous Jack by Barbara Trapido.
Brilliant. Why do you love that?
As a child who didn't grow up in a family in which I felt I was particularly cherished or loved, the theme of my life has also been about gathering family. I mean, and that's the thing where I talk about friendships as a theme, but for me, friendships are not just friendships, they are family. And Barbara Trapido, who is the most beautiful writer, just wrote a book about the family that I'd always wanted. And she has this beautiful way of writing these extraordinary characters that burst into life off the page. They create this unlikely family, and it's the family that I still want.
What advice would you give younger women?
Never stop working. Always have something for yourself because it gives you choices.
I think it's so important, and we talk so little about money in terms of giving young women proper practical knowledge and skills?
I think about the middle-aged women that came up to me in America and said, I wish I could do what you do. And the reason they can't is because they're terrified that they will end up on the streets, that their husbands will give them nothing and they will end up with nothing.
Who is your old bird role model?
My old bird role model? Oh, I think it's probably somebody like Joanna Lumley. I love her. She's glamorous, she's kind, she's grounded, she's humble, and she seems to be very real.
What's your superpower?
Lighting up a room. I have two, actually. One of them is lighting up a room. The other one is I can open a fridge that looks like it's got absolutely nothing in it. And everybody will say, well, what are we going to eat? And I can rustle up a really good meal from nothing.
That is several decades of motherhood talking right there.
Yeah. Well, there's also a bit of culinary school in there as well.
Oh, I must not get sidetracked. Last one. How many fucks do you give?
I wish I could say 0, but the truth is I still give maybe 1 fuck, but it doesn't last long. Like I will give a fuck for a maximum of 2 hours and then I let it go.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoy The Shift and would like to show your appreciation, why not buy me a coffee? Go to www.buymeacoffee.com/The Shift with Sam Baker. You can hear a new episode of The Shift every Tuesday, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like what you hear, please do rate, review, follow, tell your friends, because it really does help other people find us. And if you'd like to know more about my own experience of shifting, my book, The Shift, How I Lost and Found Myself After 40, and you can too, is out now in paperback.